It was a crisp autumn morning in the small town of Maplewood, the kind where the air feels fresh and cool against your skin. The leaves had turned shades of orange, red, and yellow, carpeting the ground beneath the towering trees. Families were out enjoying the weekend, kids chasing each other around, dogs wagging their tails as they trotted alongside their owners, and couples walking hand in hand on the winding paths of the local park. Amidst all this activity sat an elderly man on one of the wooden benches near the playground. He wasn't doing anything particularly noticeable. He just sat there quietly, watching the world go by. His name was Henry Thompson, though no one in the park knew him personally. To most people passing by, he was simply that old guy who came to the park every Saturday morning. What they didn't know, and what he never told anyone, was that those quiet mornings meant something special to him. Henry always wore the same outfit when he visited the park: faded blue jeans, a worn-out flannel shirt, and a pair of scuffed-up boots. These boots weren't just any ordinary footwear. They were relics from another time, another life. They'd been with him for decades, through thick and thin, including the years he spent serving his country during the Vietnam War. Back then, these boots had carried him across muddy fields, dense jungles, and treacherous terrains. Now they bore the marks of age, scratches, cracks, and patches, but to Henry they still held immense value. They reminded him of battles fought, friends lost, and sacrifices made. As Henry adjusted himself on the bench, leaning forward slightly, to rest his elbows on his knees, he noticed a group of teenagers approaching. There were 5 of them, all dressed casually in hoodies and sneakers, laughing loudly as they tossed a football back and forth between them. At first glance, they seemed harmless enough, just kids having fun like so many others in the park. But as they got closer, one of them spotted Henry's boots. "Dude, check out those shoes," the tallest boy said, pointing at Henry's feet. His voice carried easily over the sounds of the park, loud enough to turn a few heads nearby. "What, is this 1965? The comment drew immediate laughter from the rest of the group. One of the girls chimed in, giggling. "Oh my gosh, are those even real? Like, did he dig them up from some museum or something?" Henry didn't react outwardly. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, pretending not to hear them. Inside, however, his chest tightened ever so slightly. It wasn't the first time someone had teased him about his appearance, but it still stung. After everything he'd been through, the hardships endured, the lives touched, it was hard to sit there and listen to young people mock something that symbolized so much of his past. The teenagers continued their banter, oblivious to how their words might affect the man sitting just a few feet away. "Man, I bet he thinks he's still living in the Stone Age," another boy joked, causing the group to erupt into more laughter. Some parents walking by glanced over disapprovingly, but none of them stepped forward to say anything. People generally avoided confrontations these days, especially when it involved rowdy teens. So the scene unfolded without interruption, but not everyone ignored what was happening. A jogger running along the path leading toward the playground slowed down as he passed the group. This man was different from the usual crowd at the park. He moved with precision, his posture upright, his steps steady and deliberate. His athletic build and weathered face hinted at a lifetime of discipline and experience. Around his neck hung a set of dog tags, a subtle reminder of his own journey. This jogger was a retired Marine. He had served for 20 years, traveling to far-off lands and facing dangers most people couldn't imagine. Though he was now back home, the lessons he'd learned during his service stayed with him every single day. Respect, honor, and integrity weren't just words to him, they were principles he lived by. As he approached the group of teenagers, he couldn't help but overhear their taunts directed at the older man on the bench. Something inside him stirred. He slowed to a stop, standing tall and confident despite being outnumbered. For a moment, he simply observed the scene before making his move. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the noise like a knife slicing through butter. "What exactly do you think is funny?" he asked, his tone calm yet firm. The teenagers froze mid-laugh, suddenly aware of the imposing figure standing beside them. Their bravado faltered under his piercing gaze. And just like that, the atmosphere shifted. What started as harmless teasing quickly became a lesson none of them would soon forget. The retired Marine stood there, his presence commanding attention without him having to raise his voice. The teenagers froze mid-laugh, their earlier confidence suddenly wavering under the weight of his gaze. It wasn't just the fact that he was older or bigger than them. It was something about the way he carried himself. His posture screamed authority, and his eyes held a quiet intensity that made it clear he wasn't someone to mess with. One of the boys in the group tried to play it cool. We were just joking around, he said, his tone defensive but lacking conviction. Another teen chimed in nervously. Yeah, no big deal, man. But the Marine didn't budge. Instead, he took a step closer, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He reached up and removed the cap from his head. A simple gesture, yet one loaded with meaning. It was as if he was reminding himself and everyone else of the respect due to those who had served. Holding the cap against his chest, he glanced toward the elderly man still seated on the bench before turning back to the teenagers. You see those boots? He asked, nodding in the direction of the man they'd been mocking. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it that demanded they listen. They're not just some old shoes you can laugh at. Those boots have walked farther than you'll ever know. The group fell silent, their earlier bravado completely gone now. A few of them shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other for cues on what to say next. One girl muttered under her breath, "We didn't mean anything by it," but trailed off when she realized how weak her words sounded. The Marine ignored her half-hearted apology and pressed on. Do you even know who that man is? Do you have any idea what he's done for people like you, for all of us? His question hung in the air unanswered. None of the teenagers dared to speak. They looked down at their feet, avoiding eye contact. For the first time, they seemed to realize that maybe, just maybe, they'd crossed a line they didn't fully understand. The Marine let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing his words to sink in. Then, lowering his voice slightly, he continued, "That man sitting over there, he's not just another face in the crowd, he's a veteran. He put on a uniform and went places most of you couldn't even imagine. Places where danger lurked around every corner, where decisions had to be made in seconds and where lives were lost in the blink of an eye." He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle over the group. Some of the teenagers fidgeted uneasily, while others swallowed hard, visibly uncomfortable. But the Marine wasn't done yet. "Those boots you find so funny? They've carried him through jungles, deserts, and battlefields. They've trudged through mud and blood, through freezing cold and scorching heat. And why? So people like you could sit here today, laughing and joking without worrying about bombs falling from the sky or bullets flying past your heads." At this point, the teenagers looked genuinely ashamed. One boy shuffled his feet awkwardly, muttering, "We didn't know." "That's exactly the problem," the Marine interrupted, his voice firm but not angry. "You didn't stop to think. You saw something different, something unfamiliar, and instead of asking questions or showing curiosity, you chose to make fun of it. That's lazy. That's disrespectful. And frankly, it's unacceptable." His words hit home. The group exchanged uneasy glances, their faces flushed with embarrassment. They weren't used to being called out like this, not in public, not by someone who clearly knew what he was talking about. It was one thing to get scolded by a teacher or parent. It was entirely another to face someone who had lived through experiences they couldn't begin to comprehend. The Marine softened his tone slightly, sensing that he'd gotten through to them. "Look, I'm not here to humiliate you. I'm here because I care. I care about teaching young people like you the value of respect. Respect isn't something you earn, it's something you give, especially to those who have sacrificed everything so you can live free, safe, and happy lives." He pointed toward the elderly man again, who remained seated quietly on the bench, watching the exchange unfold without saying a word. "That man deserves your respect, not because of what he's wearing, but because of who he is and what he's done. If you don't understand that, then you need to start learning, fast." The teenagers nodded slowly, their expressions a mix of guilt and gratitude. One of them finally mustered the courage to speak. "We're sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We didn't mean to disrespect him. The Marine studied them for a moment, searching their faces for sincerity. When he was satisfied that they meant it, he gave a small nod. Good. Apologies are a start, but actions matter more. Don't let this be the end of the lesson. Think about what I've said. Remember it the next time you feel like making fun of someone for being different. With that, he turned away from the group and began walking toward the bench where the elderly man sat. As he approached, he slowed his pace, giving the man a respectful nod before stopping a few feet away. The contrast between the two men was striking. The younger, fit Marine and the older, weathered veteran. But there was a shared understanding between them, unspoken, yet unmistakable. Without waiting to be invited, the Marine extended his hand. Sir, may I sit with you for a moment? He asked politely. The elderly man hesitated briefly, then nodded and accepted the handshake. There was a quiet dignity in his demeanor, a strength that came from years of enduring hardships with grace and resilience. Together they moved to a quieter corner of the park, leaving the chastened teenagers behind. As they settled onto a new bench, the Marine introduced himself casually, explaining that he too had served in combat zones during his time in the military. I saw your boots, and he said, gesturing toward the man's feet. They reminded me of my own pair from Iraq. You don't forget shoes like that. They carry stories no one else can understand. For the first time since the encounter began, the elderly man smiled faintly. It was a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it spoke volumes. You're right about that, he admitted. These boots have been with me through thick and thin. Guess they're more sentimental than practical. Now, the Marine chuckled softly. Well, sir, if you ever need new ones, let me know. It's the least I can do after all you've done for us. The elderly man shook his head gently, though there was warmth in his expression. No need for that. These boots will last me a while longer. But thank you for standing up for me back there. Not many people would have done that. The Marine shrugged modestly. It's the least I could do. We take care of our own. And with that, the two men sat together in companionable silence, watching the world go by. Behind them, the teenagers huddled together, whispering among themselves. Though they didn't know it yet, their lives had been changed by the encounter, even if only in small ways. As the retired Marine and the elderly veteran sat together on the quieter bench, their conversation flowed naturally. There was no rush, no need to fill the silence with unnecessary words. Both men understood each other in a way that only those who had served could. They spoke of shared experiences, long nights spent under unfamiliar skies, the camaraderie of fellow soldiers, and the weight of carrying responsibilities far beyond their years. The Marine leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but still respectful. You know, he began, glancing down at the older man's boots again. I remember my first pair of combat boots. They felt like bricks strapped to my feet. Took me weeks to break them in properly. He chuckled softly, shaking his head at the memory. But once they were broken in, they became part of me, like an extension of who I was out there. The elderly man nodded knowingly. His own boots, though worn and scuffed, had once been stiff and unyielding too. Over time, they'd molded to his feet, shaped by countless miles walked in service to his country. Yeah, he said, his voice low and steady. They start off hard as rocks, don't they? But after a while, you stop noticing the discomfort. Out there, it's not about comfort, it's about survival. There was a pause as both men reflected on what that meant. Survival wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional, and often spiritual. The Marine tilted his head slightly, studying the older man with newfound admiration. How did you do it? He asked earnestly. How did you keep going when things got tough? The question caught the veteran off guard, though he didn't show it. For decades, he'd kept his struggles private, burying them deep inside where no one could see. Talking about them now felt strange, almost foreign. Still, something about this younger man sitting beside him made him want to open up. It wasn't easy, he admitted after a moment. Some days, I thought I wouldn't make it, You lose friends, brothers in arms, people you swore to protect. It changes you, makes you question everything. Your purpose, your faith, even your humanity. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But then you remind yourself why you're there. Not for glory or recognition, but because someone has to stand between chaos and the ones you love. And if you can save even one life, well, maybe it's worth it. The Marine listened intently, his expression thoughtful. He'd heard similar sentiments before from other veterans, yet hearing it firsthand carried a different kind of weight. It reminded him of his own journey. The battles fought, the sacrifices made, and the scars left behind. Some scars healed over time, fading into faint lines. Others remained raw, lingering reminders of the cost of duty. You saved more than one life, the Marine said firmly, breaking the reflective silence. All of us owe you, and so many others like you, a debt we can never repay. That's why moments like today matter. We have to remind people of what you've done, of what all of you have given. The elderly man shook his head gently, dismissing the praise. I didn't do it for gratitude, he replied. I did it because it was right, because someone had to. His humility struck a chord with the Marine. In a world obsessed with recognition and validation, here was a man who simply believed in doing what needed to be done. No fanfare, no expectations. It was a lesson worth remembering. Meanwhile, across the park, the group of teenagers lingered, awkwardly near the playground. After the stern lecture from the Marine, they hadn't dared to leave immediately. Instead, they huddled together, whispering among themselves, trying to process what had just happened. We really screwed up, didn't we? One of the boys muttered, kicking at the ground with the toe of his sneaker. His tone was heavy with guilt, the cockiness he'd displayed earlier completely gone. Another teen, the girl who'd giggled about the boots, sighed deeply. I feel awful, she confessed. We didn't mean to hurt anyone's feelings, we were just messing around. Messing around doesn't cut it, another boy chimed in sharply. That guy called us out for a reason. What if it was our grandpa sitting there, or someone else's? Would we still think it was funny? The group fell silent, each of them wrestling with their own emotions. None of them wanted to admit it, but they knew they'd crossed a line. Their careless words had wounded someone who deserved nothing less than respect. We should apologize, the tallest boy finally said, his voice firm despite the nervousness in his eyes. Not because we're scared of getting in trouble, but because it's the right thing to do. The others nodded in agreement, though none of them looked particularly eager to face the man they'd mocked. Apologies weren't easy, especially when you knew you'd messed up badly. But they also knew they couldn't walk away without making amends. Taking a deep breath, the group slowly approached the bench where the two men sat. The Marine noticed them first, his sharp gaze flickering toward the teenagers as they hesitated a few feet away. Sensing their intention, he gave the elderly man a reassuring pat on the shoulder before standing up. I'll give you some space, he said quietly, stepping aside to let them speak directly to the man they'd wronged. The teenagers exchanged nervous glances before one of them stepped forward. It was the same boy who had initially pointed out the boots, the ringleader of their earlier teasing. Now his bravado was replaced with genuine remorse. Sir, he began, his voice trembling slightly. We're really sorry. About earlier. We didn't mean any disrespect. The elderly man studied them for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, ever so slightly, he nodded. Apology accepted, he said simply. His tone wasn't warm or forgiving, but it wasn't cold either. It was neutral, leaving room for reflection. One of the girls spoke up next, her voice barely above a whisper. We didn't we didn't know you were a veteran. If we had, we would have never said those things. The elderly man raised an eyebrow slightly, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. It's okay, he said. You're young. You make mistakes. Just try to learn from them. The group nodded fervently, relief washing over their faces. They thanked him quickly before retreating, their steps lighter now that the weight of guilt had lifted, at least partially. As they walked away, they couldn't help but glance back at the man on the bench. Something about him stuck with them, a quiet strength that commanded respect even in silence. Back at the bench, the Marine returned to sit beside the elderly man. "Looks like they learned something today," he remarked, watching the teenagers disappear into the distance. The veteran shrugged modestly. "Maybe. Or maybe they'll forget by tomorrow. Either way, it's not my job to hold grudges." The Marine smiled, appreciating the man's wisdom. Forgiveness came easily to some, while others carried resentment for years. This man seemed to embody the former, choosing to let go rather than dwell on past hurts. "You're stronger than most people realize," the Marine said after a moment. "Not everyone could handle that situation with such grace." The elderly man chuckled, softly, the sound warm and genuine. "Grace isn't mine to claim," he replied. "It comes from knowing you've done your best, from accepting that life is messy, people are flawed, and sometimes forgiveness is the only way forward." His words resonated deeply with the Marine, who found himself nodding in agreement. Life was indeed messy, full of misunderstandings, missteps, and moments of redemption. Today had been one of those moments, a chance to learn, to grow, and to honor those who had paved the way for others. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, the two men continued their conversation. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories and laughter as strangers turned into friends. And somewhere in the background, the teenagers walked home, their hearts a little heavier, but also a little wiser, carrying with them a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. The conversation between the retired Marine and the elderly veteran continued as the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky. The air grew cooler, carrying with it the faint scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Both men seemed content to sit together, exchanging stories that only those who had walked similar paths could truly understand. At one point, the Marine leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His tone shifted from reflective to curious. "Tell me something," he said, looking directly at the older man. "What kept you going when things got really tough? Out there, I mean, in the thick of it all?" The question wasn't casual. It carried weight, a desire to learn from someone who had been through more than most could imagine. For a moment, the elderly man didn't respond. He stared ahead, his eyes focused on the horizon, but clearly seeing something else entirely. Memories long buried, resurfacing like waves lapping at the shore. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer now, tinged with both sadness and resolve. "You hold on to what matters," he said simply. "Family back home, the buddies standing beside you, the belief that what you're doing means something, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time." He paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. "There were nights when I thought about giving up. Nights so dark you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face, cold, hungry, scared, wondering if anyone even cared whether you made it out alive." He shook his head slightly, as if brushing away the ghosts of those memories. "But then you'd hear a joke from one of your guys, or you'd remember your mom's voice telling you she was proud of you. Little things like that. They kept you moving forward." The Marine nodded slowly, absorbing every word. He understood exactly what the older man meant. Those small moments of humanity, no matter how fleeting, often made all the difference. They reminded you that you weren't just a soldier. You were still a person, with a heart capable of hope and love. "And the fear?" the Marine asked, quietly. "How did you deal with that?" The elderly man chuckled dryly, though there was no humor in it. "You don't deal with it," he replied. "It's always there, lurking in the back of your mind. You can't outrun it, and you can't pretend it doesn't exist. All you can do is keep putting one foot in front of the other and trust that you'll make it through somehow." His honesty struck a chord with the Marine. Fear wasn't something talked about openly among soldiers. It was seen as weakness, a vulnerability best hidden. But here was a man unafraid to admit that he'd felt it too, that it had shaped him in ways he still carried decades later. "You ever regret it?" The Marine ventured cautiously. "Signing up, I mean. Going through all of that?" The elderly man tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "Regret's a funny thing," he said after a pause. "Sure, there are days when I wonder what my life might have looked like if I'd chosen a different path. Maybe I'd have stayed closer to home, built a family sooner, lived without some of the scars I carry now. He gestured vaguely toward himself, not needing to elaborate on what those scars entailed. But then I think about the people we helped, the lives saved, the communities protected, and I know I wouldn't trade that for anything, not even peace of mind. His words hung in the air, heavy yet comforting. The Marine sat back, letting them sink in. He realized that this man wasn't just sharing his story. He was passing down wisdom earned through pain and perseverance. It was a gift, one he wouldn't take lightly. Across the park, the teenagers had found a quiet spot near the edge of the playground. They sat huddled together on a low wall, their earlier energy replaced by somber reflection. None of them spoke right away, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, the tallest boy broke the silence. "I feel like such an idiot," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "We had no idea who that guy was, no idea what he'd been through." Another teen nodded vigorously. "Yeah, seriously. What kind of jerk laughs at someone's shoes without knowing why they're wearing them? That was so messed up." The girl who'd giggled earlier sighed deeply, her guilt evident. "I hate that we hurt him. Even if he forgave us, I'll still feel bad about it." "Good," the third boy said firmly. "You should feel bad. We screwed up big time, but maybe we can fix it. Like, actually fix it." The group turned to look at him, curiosity mingling with uncertainty. "What do you mean?" the tallest boy asked. "Well," the third boy explained, his tone gaining confidence, "we could do something nice for him, something real, like, I don't know, buy him new shoes or something. Show him we're sorry in a way that actually means something." The idea caught fire quickly. One by one, the teenagers chimed in with suggestions, their initial hesitation melting away as they embraced the chance to make amends. By the time they finished brainstorming, they had a plan. They would pool their money, visit a nearby shoe store, and pick out a brand new pair of boots for the man they'd mocked earlier. With renewed purpose, the group set off toward the shops, lining Main Street. Along the way, they couldn't stop talking about how much they'd learned, not just from the Marines' lecture, but from the whole experience. For many of them, it was the first time they'd truly considered the sacrifices made by veterans and active duty service members. It was humbling, eye-opening, and a little overwhelming. When they reached the shoe store, they entered hesitantly, unsure where to start. A salesperson greeted them warmly, sensing their nervousness. "Can I help you find something?" she asked kindly. "We're looking for boots," the tallest boy replied, glancing at his friends for support. "Nice ones, something sturdy, dependable, like the kind soldiers wear." The salesperson raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "For yourself?" she asked, looking at the group. "No," the girl interjected quickly. "For someone else, someone who deserves them." Something about the sincerity in her voice softened the salesperson's expression. She smiled gently. "Well, let's see what we've got." Together, they browsed the selection, eventually settling on a high-quality pair of leather boots, designed for durability and comfort. The teenagers pooled their cash, counting out crumpled bills and loose change until they had enough to cover the cost. When the transaction was complete, they left the store clutching the box, their hearts lighter than they'd been in hours. Back at the park, the Marine and the elderly veteran were still deep in conversation. Neither of them noticed the teenagers, approaching until they stood awkwardly a few feet away, holding the neatly wrapped box. Sir?" the tallest boy called out tentatively. Both men turned to look at them, surprised. The elderly man raised an eyebrow, while the Marine crossed his arms, watching silently to see what would happen next. The boy stammered, suddenly unsure of himself. "We wanted to say sorry again, but also, well, we got you these." He held out the box awkwardly, his cheeks flushing red. The elderly man stared at the offering for a moment, then slowly took it from the boys' hands. He opened the lid carefully, revealing the gleaming new boots inside. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, lifting his gaze to meet theirs, he gave a small, grateful smile. "You didn't have to do this," he said softly. "But thank you." The teenagers beamed, relief washing over them. "We wanted to," the girl piped up, "to show we're really sorry, and to say thank you for everything." The Marine stepped forward then, clapping a hand on the elderly man's shoulder. "Looks like redemption comes in all shapes and sizes," he remarked with a grin. As the teenagers lingered for a few more moments, thanking the man again before heading off, the Marine and the veteran returned to their bench. Watching the young group disappear into the distance, the older man shook his head in quiet amazement. "They'll be okay," the Marine said confidently. "They learned something today. That's what counts." The elderly man nodded, cradling the box of boots in his lap. "Maybe," he agreed, "or maybe they'll forget by tomorrow. Either way, it's not my job to hold grudges." And with that, the two men sat in companionable silence once more, the fading sunlight casting golden hues across the park. It had been a day full of lessons, for the teenagers, for the Marine, and perhaps even for the veteran himself. Life, messy and unpredictable as it was, had given them all a second chance. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the park grew quieter. Families packed up their picnic blankets, children reluctantly left the playground, and joggers wrapped up their final laps for the day. The world seemed to settle into a calmer rhythm, mirroring the reflective mood of the two men still seated on the bench. The elderly veteran held the box containing the new boots gently in his lap, running his fingers lightly over the smooth surface. He hadn't said much since the teenagers had walked away, but his expression spoke volumes, a mixture of gratitude, surprise, and perhaps even a touch of nostalgia. After a long silence, he finally turned to the Marine sitting beside him. "No," he began, his voice soft but steady. "I wasn't expecting that. Not from them." The Marine glanced at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "People can surprise you sometimes," he replied, "especially when they're given the chance to do better." The older man nodded thoughtfully, his gaze drifting back to the box. "It's not the boots themselves," he continued after a moment. "It's what they represent. Those kids, they didn't have to come back. They could have walked away, muttered their apologies, and forgotten about me by tomorrow. But they didn't. They chose to make it right." He paused as if weighing his next words carefully. "That takes guts. More than most people give young folks credit for." The Marine chuckled softly, leaning back against the bench. "You'd be surprised how often people rise to the occasion when someone believes in them. Maybe those kids realized they were capable of more than they thought." For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the rustling leaves overhead and the distant chirping of birds preparing to roost for the night. It was peaceful, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos both men had experienced in their respective lives. Yet, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Peace was hard-won, fragile, and worth protecting. Eventually, the Marine broke the silence. "Do you think they'll remember this?" he asked, nodding toward the direction the teenagers had gone. "Or will it just fade away once life gets busy again?" The veteran considered the question, his weathered face thoughtful. "Hard to say," he admitted. "Some lessons stick with you forever, while others slip through the cracks. But I like to believe that moments like today leave a mark, even if it's small. A seed planted in their minds, reminding them to think twice before judging someone else." The Marine nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the response. "A seed, huh? That's a good way to put it. Sometimes all it takes is one meaningful moment to change the course of someone's life." They sat there for a few more minutes, watching the last remnants of daylight linger on the horizon. Eventually, the Marine stood up, stretching his arms above his head. "Well, sir," he said, turning to face the older man, "I should probably get going. Got some things to take care of before calling it a night." The veteran looked up at him, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Thank you," he said simply, "for standing up for me, for reminding those kids, and maybe even me, what respect looks like." The Marine waved off the gratitude with a dismissive gesture. "No need to thank me. Like I said earlier, we take care of our own." Always have. Always will. With that, he extended his hand once more, and the two men shook, firmly. There was no need for further words. Everything that needed to be said had already passed between them. As the Marine walked away, his footsteps steady and purposeful, the veteran watched him go, feeling a renewed sense of connection. Not just to the younger man, but to the broader community of service members who shared his values. Meanwhile, the group of teenagers had made their way to a nearby diner, eager to decompress after the whirlwind of emotions they'd experienced that afternoon. Sliding into a booth near the window, they ordered milkshakes and fries, their earlier tension giving way to laughter and conversation. But beneath the lighthearted banter, the weight of the day lingered. "I still can't believe we did that," the tallest boy said, shaking his head as he sipped his chocolate shake. "Like, actually apologized and bought him new shoes. Feels kinda weirdly good, you know?" One of the girls nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, totally. I mean, I feel bad about what happened, obviously, but I also feel proud. Like, we messed up, sure, but we fixed it. That counts for something, right?" Another teen chimed in, twirling a fry between his fingers. "It's crazy how much one little thing can change your perspective. I've never really thought about veterans before. Not like that, anyway. Now I keep wondering what else I don't know. What else I'm missing." The group fell silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, the third boy spoke up, his tone serious, yet hopeful. "Maybe this is a start," he suggested. "Like maybe we can pay attention more. Ask questions instead of assuming stuff. Try to understand where people are coming from." His words resonated with the others, sparking a lively discussion about ways they could continue learning and growing. One idea led to another, and soon they were brainstorming ways to honor veterans in their community, organizing fundraisers, volunteering at local shelters, or even starting a school project to document stories from older generations. By the time they finished their meal and stepped back out into the cool evening air, their spirits were noticeably lighter. The guilt and shame that had weighed them down earlier had transformed into determination, a desire to turn their mistake into something positive. They parted ways with promises to stay in touch and work together on their newfound mission. Back at the park, the elderly veteran remained on the bench, the box of boots resting beside him. He gazed out at the empty playground, now bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, and allowed himself a rare moment of introspection. Today had been unexpected in so many ways, from the teenager's initial mockery to the Marine's intervention, and finally, to the heartfelt apology and gift. Each event had reminded him of something important: humanity's capacity for both cruelty and kindness. Picking up the box, he stood slowly, feeling the familiar creak in his knees. As he made his way toward the park exit, he couldn't help but smile faintly. Life, he mused, was full of contradictions. Painful memories coexisted with moments of grace. Strangers became allies in the blink of an eye. And forgiveness, though difficult, was always possible. Reaching the edge of the park, he stopped briefly to glance back at the bench where he'd spent the afternoon. Somewhere along the way, he'd gained more than just a pair of new boots. He'd gained a renewed faith in the goodness of people, and that, he decided, was worth holding on to. The elderly veteran walked slowly down the quiet street that led away from the park, his steps steady but deliberate. The box containing the new boots was tucked securely under one arm, and though it wasn't heavy, he carried it with a sense of reverence, as if it held more than just leather and laces. The evening air was crisp now, carrying with it the faint scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting pools of golden light onto the pavement as he passed beneath them. His mind wandered back over the events of the day, replaying moments like scenes from a movie. He thought about the teenagers' laughter, when they'd first mocked his boots, their careless words cutting deeper than they probably realized. Then came the Marine's arrival, his commanding presence, his unwavering defense, and the way he'd reminded everyone present of what respect truly meant. And finally, there were the teenagers themselves, returning with apologies and a gift that spoke volumes about their willingness to grow. It struck him how quickly things could shift. from hurt to healing, from misunderstanding to connection. Life had a funny way of teaching lessons when you least expected them. For years, he'd kept his experiences locked away, rarely speaking of the sacrifices he'd made or the battles he'd fought. But today, something had changed. Today, he'd seen firsthand how sharing even a small piece of his story could inspire others to think differently, to act with greater compassion. As he turned onto his block, the familiar sight of his modest home brought a sense of comfort. It wasn't much, a cozy little house with faded paint and a garden that hadn't been tended in ages. But it was his sanctuary. Stepping inside, he placed the box carefully on the kitchen table before sinking into a chair. For a while, he simply sat there, letting the quiet envelop him. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. Opening the box, he lifted out the brand new boots, holding them up to examine them more closely. They were sturdy and well made, designed to last through whatever challenges lay ahead. He ran his fingers along the smooth leather, marveling at the craftsmanship. These weren't just shoes, they were a symbol of redemption, of second chances. But as he set them aside, he couldn't help but glance toward the corner of the room where his old boots rested. Those scuffed-up, worn-out companions had been with him through so much: the mud of Vietnam, the dust of training grounds, the sidewalks of countless towns where he'd walked alone after coming home. They weren't practical anymore. Not really. Yet they carried stories no new pair ever could. Stories of resilience, of survival, of finding meaning even in the darkest times. For a long moment, he debated silently with himself. Should he retire the old boots, or should he keep wearing them, holding on to the memories they represented? Finally, he decided, both would have their place. The new boots would serve him well for everyday use, while the old ones would remain as a reminder, a testament to where he'd been and how far he'd come. Meanwhile, across town, the group of teenagers gathered outside the diner, reluctant to part ways just yet. Their earlier excitement had mellowed into a quieter kind of camaraderie, born from shared reflection and newfound purpose. One of them pulled out their phone, scrolling through social media feeds until inspiration struck. "Hey guys," the tallest boy said suddenly, snapping the others out of their thoughts. "What if we started something bigger? Like, not just for veterans, but for anyone who deserves recognition. People who've done amazing things but don't get enough credit." The idea sparked immediate interest. "Like a tribute page or something," the girl suggested, her eyes lighting up. "We could share stories, photos, videos, anything to remind people of all the good happening around us." Another teen nodded eagerly. "Yeah, and maybe we could organize events too. Fundraisers, volunteer days, stuff like that. Show people we're serious about making a difference." Before long, the group was buzzing with plans, each suggestion building on the last. By the time they finally said their goodbyes and headed home, they felt energized, hopeful even. What had started as an embarrassing mistake had blossomed into something meaningful, a chance to create positive change in their community. Back at the park, the retired Marine jogged along the same path he'd taken earlier that morning. The air was cooler now, and the sky above was a deep indigo dotted with stars beginning to peek through. His pace was slower this time, less driven by routine and more by contemplation. Today had been a reminder of why he'd chosen to serve in the first place, not for glory or recognition, but to protect the values he believed in: honor, integrity, respect. He thought about the elderly veteran, whose quiet strength had left a lasting impression. There was dignity in the way the man carried himself, a grace that came from knowing who you were and standing firm in your convictions. It was a lesson worth remembering, especially in a world that often seemed to prioritize noise over substance. Reaching the bench where the two men had sat together earlier, the Marine slowed to a stop. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the empty playground bathed in soft lamplight. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the faint hum of traffic drifted through the stillness. It was peaceful here, a stark contrast to the chaos he'd witnessed overseas. Taking a deep breath, he reached up and removed his cap once more, holding it against his chest in a gesture of silent gratitude. To him, this park wasn't just a place, it was a reminder of the connections that mattered most. Between strangers, between generations, between those who served and those who benefited from their sacrifices. These bonds, fragile yet unbreakable, were what made life worth living. With a final nod to the empty bench, he turned and resumed his jog, his stride steady and purposeful. As he disappeared into the night, the park settled back into its usual rhythm, waiting patiently for the next chapter of its story to unfold. In the end, the day had touched everyone involved in different ways. For the teenagers, it was a wake-up call, a chance to confront their own biases and step up as better versions of themselves. For the Marine, it was a reaffirmation of the principles he'd dedicated his life to upholding. And for the elderly, veteran, it was a reminder that even in a world that sometimes felt indifferent, kindness and understanding could still shine through. Life, messy and unpredictable as it was, continued moving forward. But within each of them, something had shifted, something subtle yet profound. A lesson learned, a bond formed, a heart opened. And as the stars blinked overhead, casting their gentle glow over Maplewood, it was clear that the ripple effects of that single afternoon would linger long after the sun rose again.